everyone, welcome to For the Love of Teaching. Welcome to this channel. I personally like to introduce both of us. I'm Richa and he's Abhi, and we're going to have a lot of fun here. So for today, we're going to start with discussing economic history of India post independence. So yeah, over to Abhi.
Right. Hi, thank you, Richa. So, we'll be discussing the economic history of India, particularly post-independence. Right. So, after 1947, the economic history of India, the path that India took, can be divided into two distinct phases. One was from 1947 to 1979, and the other was from 1980 to the present day. Now, this breakpoint of 1980 that we have taken is very important, particularly to our discussion, primarily because common assumption amongst most of us is that the increase in the rate of growth of the GDP was primarily because of the economic reforms of the 1990s. But the fact of the matter is, while the reforms undertaken during the 90s were by no measure insignificant, careful analysis of data as studied through our review of literature clearly indicates that the spurt and rate of growth of GDP in the 90s was merely a continuation of the steps that were initiated in the 1980s. So the actual breakpoint was the 1980s, right? And that this was not a standalone, and the 1990s thing was not a standalone thing. Now, why were those changes initiated in the 1980s? Will also be something that we'll be discussing, right? So the 3 decades post independence, the economic policy decisions of that period was influenced by a confluence of ideologies and assumptions, some of which in retrospect is perhaps misplaced. Right. Now, where did it come from? The intellectual leadership of that time functioned on the basic premise that since there existed a structural weakness in the Indian economy, the only way forward was complete state control of the economy. Now, this was also reflective of the grave distrust that the then leadership had towards the private entities, to the private agencies. Now, what did this result in? This resulted in a slew of reforms, which can be classified into three categories. Nationalization was done. Legislative and executive control was increased, and public investment was infused into the market to ensure that state hegemony on the market was maintained. These measures originated from the fear of market failure. What is market failure? Market failure is when individuals acting in self-interest might not translate to the common good, to social interest being met. That is, it results in inefficient distribution of goods and services, which at that particular point in time was something that everyone was promoting. Also, because of the kind of legacy that we had, right? Now, these notions are clearly evident in the socialist economic policy that was propounded in the 1931 Karachi session of the Congress. So, it was not something that had started after 1947. It was a continuation of of the policies that were being proposed by the intellectual leaders of the country. Now, even the first phase can further be divided into two phases, from 47 to 66 and from 67 to 79. Now, what happened in the first phase was that it was mostly driven by a sense of moral righteousness and a developmental enthusiasm, which is based on Fabian socialism and the Soviet model.
Right.
Further, the best academics of the time from all over the world would come to India in order to implement the ideas of socialism.
Right.
Post 66, this slowly started to fade away. The fervor and the sense of morality started to seep away. And what replaced it was economic policy, which was not coherent, which was primarily used as a political tool. And as as a populist move in order to garner votes, which is
Right.
again which can be explained by the kind of political scenario that existed at that point in time. Now,
Mhm.
what did all of this lead to? This led to a economy which had a growth rate of only 3.5% and 1.5% per capita growth. This
Right.
was largely the result of a noose-like control on the economy by the legislature, the executive, nationalization, inward-looking policies, and crowding out of investment, which finally resulted in a combination of forced private inefficiency and an innate public inefficiency.
Right.
Now, what happened in the second phase? Now, second phase is called the market reform phase. By the 1980s, during Indira Gandhi's second term, she had shed a lot of her previous socialist baggage. The shackles on the market was now slowly being removed, and the control was being given away to the market. Now, a very interesting observation of what happened here is that is in the kind of growth in GDP that resulted from the increase in the kind of increase in private investment. What was seen was that even with a very small increase in private investment, the kind of increase in GDP was phenomenal. The reason was the um, the reason was what motivated the two entities. So initially, when a public entity was making the calls, it had a lot of things that it needed to um, address. But a private entity's primary objective is profit maximization. So it knows exactly where the investment must go. So even with a small increase in investment of private entities, it resulted in maximization for the profit maximization for these entities. Now, while the reforms of the right, uh, yeah, so successive governments understood the need to reform and liberalize the economy to achieve this growth and the growth that the Indian market had potential for. While the reforms of the 80s and subsequently of the 90s, it did result in spurt of growth. Further analysis indicates that it was again restricted in 2003 2004. This was because of the this was because of the gaps in public policy that existed that the future governments were not able to implement properly, and the lack of quality public goods like roads, electricity, and railway infrastructure that did not exist. And as I said further, you know, growing dissent within the ruling coalition, it weakened the resolve of successive governments to introduce more reforms. And what is unfortunate is that even today, with a government that has a significant strength in the parliament, is finding it difficult to implement long overdue economic and market reforms, which needs to change.
Yep.
So yeah, I'm done. Uh,
Yeah.
I
Thank
would
you,
love to know.
Abhijit, for putting. Yeah. Thank you. I think he has put he's given us so much information so efficiently in such a short period of time. Now, my job is to unpack some of it. Given the limitation of time, we'll unpack some of the information given here, and I'd like to start with what we inherited as a legacy. So, colonialism gave us a lot of things. Took away a lot of things from us, but one of the legacies that we inherited from a colonial past was aversion towards trade. So let us think about markets in general. What do we have to offer in markets? Markets are basically a place where we transact. It's a place of transaction. Um, and what the legacy that we inherited from colonialism was um, we were averse to trading. We were averse to being exploited by companies who came in as traders, by entities who came in as traders and then occupied the state, then occupied power, then had so much power over us. So they took over the entire country or the and they took over the decision making processes. So as you mentioned, even the freedom movements, freedom struggles that concentrated on boycotting the foreign goods or Swadeshi movement, it the economic environment was such that we naturally looked inwards. We naturally contracted. I see it as a contraction rather than a logical step. At that point of time, of course, it looked logical because as I think, as you've mentioned, that we were able to attain a certain growth. We were able to make economic, we able to make certain kind of economic progress, but we were not able to sustain it. It remained stuck there, and quite antithetically, it was named Hindu rate of growth. There's nothing there's nothing Hindu about that rate of growth because we are all about expansion and we are all about fair transaction and flow of wealth and creation of wealth. However, because of our colonial experience, I personally have an opinion that we and later it was resonated by so-called industrialists, big industrialists of the country, including Tata, that wealth was seen as bad. Capital generation was seen as something bad because capital was seen as something was seen as a tool to exploit. So our policies were generally motivated by these opinions. In these series of lectures, Abhijit is very good at facts and pointed information. I'm very good at unpacking, so you can expect that from us. Um, so we're going to look at that. So one is our colonial past motivated how our policies are made. We were averse towards trade, one, we were averse towards capital. Now, given these two standpoints, the general mood of that time was who should step in to ensure fairness in terms of distribution of resources. Uh, state state should step in. So it's the principle of Keynesian economics as well. Fair distribution of resources. Public, if public infrastructure is used to promote general good, then people might be lifted out of poverty. It will ensure fairness in terms of distribution of resources, and of course, the model was taken by Soviet infrastructure. So Soviet model was opted for in India as well, because as we know, our first Prime Minister, Mr. Nehru, was very inspired by the socialist model of development in terms of how much, if a state takes control of resources, how much infrastructure can be built. And if public infrastructure is built, the general idea is everyone benefits from public infrastructure. However, as we've seen from 70 years of our journey, that is pretty much contested. That public infrastructure is public infrastructure really accessible to all? But that was the general idea. So our standpoint where we started in 1947 was we were averse to wealth. We were averse to wealth creation, and understandably so.
And it also makes
And
sense, right? Yeah, I'm sorry.
mhm.
But
Yeah,
yeah,
sure, please.
it also kind of makes sense that people at that point in time, uh, especially because of the freedom movement that was going on, people would want the state to be in charge because what were they demanding? They were, so first of all, as you said, the British had come in because of mercantilism, and the natural reaction to that by the Indian populace would be to oppose anything that was industrial in that sense. And
Mhm.
what were the demands? The demand was to take back power and give it to the people. And who is the best
Right.
representative of the people? And therefore, the resources um, matlab, should be retained by the people. And who is the best representative of the people? It is the state. And the Mai Baap ka whole
In
thing.
their understanding.
Exactly.
Yeah, so that was the paternalistic understanding of state, and which still partly exists now. Yeah, according to me, the Indian populace is still averse to that change because of so many reasons. State took over as someone who rescues you from oppression. this state you can choose, this state you can elect, this state you can abuse, that you have some power over. Uh, you know, so this became sort of your provider. What it did was, I think it was necessary at that point of time. I'm saying that it was sort of a good model to adopt for 15-20 years. However, that led to, on an individual level, led to state dependency, and that is exactly what any socialist model of development uh, does. Whether it's the theoretical aim of that model or not, that's completely debatable, but this is what it leads to. So individuals look up to state for uh, jobs, for wealth, so uh, let's look at mercantilism, like as opposed to this. The model of mercantilism that was used by European countries to colonize was to they basically sourced wealth from developing, not de- sorry, colonized countries to make themselves rich. So of course it was an exploitative model. Uh, However, that was the larger sort of, that was a larger picture. So wealth be- wealth became the enemy. So if the state gives you a job, you look up to state for security, not wealth. If if the state gives you a secure job for your survival, for your family, to tend to your family and to look after your family, you're pretty happy. But what it did was, in the long run, wealth runs out, right? Because ultimately, uh, capital comes from taxes and it circulates in the economy. So that is about that. In the second phase, what should we talk about in the second phase? Give me some ideas.
Before we get to the second phase, so I
Uh-huh.
agree that the things that were done post 1947 did increase GDP of the country to an extent, because the rate of growth of GDP before independence was, if I'm not wrong, in the negative. And of
Mhm.
course, it was because of the Second World War and the Great Depression. All of that had its effects. But the measures taken by the then government did increase it to 3.5%. But the problem is that it
Yes.
stayed at 3.5%.
Yes.
It did not increase after that. And what is interesting is that industries that survived the
The onslaught of British government
exactly,
and
they were stormed down by the very government that was elected by the people of this country. They were
yes,
pushed
yes,
back, and their opportunities were taken away by an
mhm,
elected government, which is baffling to yeah.
yes. I invite all the viewers to think about this problem. That there's an industry survived the onslaught of a foreign government, and then the people elected a government, and I think the moral ethos of that time was in favor of this. Uh, that was sort of forcibly taken away from industrialists because they have the opinion was that they had too much wealth and they might use it for ulterior purposes. So even the indigenous companies were not trusted. And it's funny because 50 years down the line, 60 years down the line, these industries are getting privatized again. So of course that's a failure of state on some part, and we can contemplate on that question as well sometime later, because this is not a discussion for that. Uh, Again, so when our attitude shifted in the second half of the phase, when our attitude shifted to privatization, we realized that state taking control of everything. I understand it as a reaction to the colonial experience that we had. Then came private enterprises, where we started to trust private enterprises and private entities with money. Now, let us think about this question: who are private entities? Who are private entities? Private entities are people like us, individuals. So I understand it as, uh, people sort of trusting themselves with money trusting trusting their neighbor with their money rather than the government, because as of now, for good subsistence, you depended on the state. For like, if you needed to travel by air, you sort of depended on the uh,
State.
sorry for that. You
Sorry.
depended on the state, and now you decide to trust industrialists, people basically who have a penchant for wealth generation, which is a very different model of economics, and which is basically which ties in with consumerism as well. Uh, that got place after 1990s. So here is so I think we should end this short snapshot of Indian economics after 1947. I hope you guys enjoyed it and stay tuned for more.
Thank you.